Yes, yes. You mentioned Batman, so
Mhm.
we're talking about the world's greatest detective right now. I mean, you
Yeah.
did one huge run on the character, and you basically took all of his history and
Mhm.
brought it in your comics. Plus, you have the I don't know if I can call it privilege or whatever, but you killed the character twice. First in Batman
Mhm.
Rest in Peace, and second in Final Crisis. Although, as you
Yeah.
said on that spectacular splash page, Batman and Robin will never die. So
Mhm.
my question for you is, what was the most exciting part for you of writing this monumental icon, and at the same time, what was the most difficult for you in your take on the character?
Well, I'd kind of written Batman before. Obviously, Arkham Asylum
Yeah.
was pretty successful with Batman, but that was a weird Batman story, a different kind of story. Then he was in Justice League. He was a major figure in Justice League. But I did Gothic as well. So Batman was kind of always hanging around. And when they asked me to do it, I wasn't sure because it seemed as if everything had been done with Batman, and even the first idea I had for a story, which became the Three Ghosts of Batman, where I thought, well, what does the Gotham Police Department do in case Batman disappears one time? What if they're training replacements? Wouldn't that be an interesting story? And then I find out they did that story in like 1956, so it became a smaller thing. But the breakthrough for me was just thinking, what's the one story nobody's told? It's like, how did he get to be like this? And particularly just before I took over, Batman was what fans kind of called Bat Jerk. He'd become super paranoid and angry, and he was all about the mission, and he seemed really tight-assed and kind of inhuman. And that wasn't the Batman that I'd remembered. So I was kind of thinking, how did he get to this? And then looking at all the stories, I thought, well, my God, the guy's this, Batgirl's been shot in the spine, Robin's been beaten to death, there's No Man's Land had Gotham City reduced to rubble, and his mission has been a complete and utter disaster. No wonder he's miserable. And it seemed to make sense then. So from there, I was able to take him forward from that and think, okay, here's a Batman who's brought to the lowest ebb. What does he do? He takes a year off and goes and sits in a cave for 48 days in the Himalayas and goes through this death ritual to try and become the reborn Batman, to try and burn out all the previous karma. And because of that, I thought, well, all the previous karma is what? And what it was the entire history of Batman going back to Detective Comics number 27. And I found that it was really effective. Unlike Superman, Batman's had a pretty straight run since he began. There's not been a lot of changes until Scott Snyder came in and changed the origin a little bit. But he's very consistent. So it seemed there was definitely a story to be told by just saying, this is what this guy has been through. And I worked out a timeline where it's kind of, I started Batman out younger than most people. I think Frank Miller has him starting around 25. I thought he'd want to get straight into the mission as soon as he could. So for me, Batman was like 21, and he'd done his training as a teenager, and he just can't wait to get into the mission. So he starts as a young man, and the stories then progress. He meets Robin, and Robin's kind of the cool version of him. He lost young Bruce Wayne at the age of 10, and suddenly this kid comes along who's what Bruce Wayne might have been if his parents hadn't died. So I found that everything worked really well as a kind of psychological progression. And Batman lightens up. He's hanging about with Robin, and Robin just wants to jump about laughing and collect trophies. And suddenly the Batcave starts to fill up with cool stuff. And the angry young Batman becomes this almost fatherly figure which corresponds with the 40s and the 50s comics. And we went through like that. In the 60s, Robin leaves, Dick Grayson leaves, Batman he becomes a solo operative again in Gotham City. And so that just seemed like that's a really interesting story. Suddenly the kid's gone, and Bruce Wayne goes into this kind of hairy chest James Bond thing where he's fighting Ra's al Ghul and Talia. And so he goes from being this fatherly figure to being a kind of, 40s dad. It's the guy who's just got divorced and he buys himself a Ferrari and suddenly he's out in the town again. And Batman fit that mold. And the whole thing tied together beautifully. And he picks up a new Robin comes along, and that Robin dies. So Batman gets darker and darker and darker. But as you can see, I mean, the progression it works really well. You can get the whole. It means that anyone can pick up a comic from the 40s or the 50s and see that it's kind of the same guy. And so that's what we went with, and that became the master key for me to Batman. That it's all one story, it's all one person, and he's been through a lot, you know. But because he'd lasted so long in my story, he's not just starting out. He's a Batman who's been around for a while. And I figured that man, if we took him seriously, then this is a guy who's fought gods with the Justice League. This is a guy who's been through all these amazing kind of adventures. He's a martial arts master in many disciplines. He's you know, we've been told his mind is brilliant. So I suddenly thought, if that guy's for real and he manages to survive for 15 years, then he's going to be somebody really quite special. And he's not going to be the paranoid loner. He's not going to be the messed up, angry Batman who can't get over his parents' death. I figured that this guy has been through it all. And it's how I felt about all the main DC heroes. You know, they've been around for so long. It's great to write them as competent, you know, and that I felt separated me. I think a lot of writers come in and they want to humanize them. But how can you humanize a guy who's done all this? He's gone beyond anything you will understand. So for me, it became the aspirational notion of how do I think my way into the mind of someone who's done all this, who has these abilities, who can fly into space, he can fly jets, every skill you can imagine, this guy has it. That's not a normal person. That's not a person with the same emotional problems the rest of us have. So for me, that became exciting. It's like exploring that guy and how he deals with his troubles, which is very unusual. The way he deals with his trauma and his troubles is very unusual. He puts on a cape and he makes all these fabulous toys. So that just the basis of Batman became the building blocks for something that seemed a much wider look at Batman, where he could laugh, where he could be angry, where he could have all these elements to his personality that had been kind of kicked out of him over the last few years before I started.
Yeah, still I love very much as you mentioned, the psychological take on the character. I mean, all the Zur-En-Arrh or Batman Rest in Peace part of your story is an analysis of the psychology of a man who done it all and who cannot survive that. I mean, it's exciting to read on one of the most mainstream titles in the market. And when you were writing it, I think it was like, I mean, it is still number one best-selling title of both the majors for mostly ever. So it's interesting how your different I mean, even for some most difficult ideas to give to the mainstreams came to the story, and in the end became a mosaic, which is if you read if you binge read the whole block, it doesn't seem like you know, like weird. In the end, it's perfect. Yeah. But when I was reading it issue by issue, it felt like something completely different from what I've read, because it was, I don't know, a new take with new characters. And this is what I like most of your writing. I mean, not being afraid of writing about apophenia in Batman and create new characters that last in the most mainstream comic there is.
Well, I think, honestly, I think Batman can carry that. Batman is a very malleable character, so I felt quite confident that he could handle it. And it worked out. You know, the sales weren't that great to start with, but once people saw the shape of it, once we got to Batman R.I.P., it just went through the roof and stayed there. And so that gave me, as I say, the confidence to do things like bringing in Dick Grayson as Robin and Damian as Dick Grayson as Batman and Damian as Robin, which, as I've said before, I would have done that for 5 years. You know, I think that pairing was a really great take on Batman and Robin. But whatever happened, it allowed me to make new things. It allowed me to add stuff to the mythology. It allowed me to look at the mythology through a different lens, and also to say, to contradict the kind of idea that Batman's a paranoid loner by saying that no, the first thing he did when he became Batman was to ring the bell to call for help. And Batman's always had help, and it was kind of a revelation to people, thinking, wait a minute, this is loner. He's not a loner. He's got a guy that picks up his plates after him. He's got all these friends. He's got Batgirls and Batboys, and they're all over the place. So it was almost like bringing it back to that, to say this isn't someone who's paranoid or lonely or lacking in an ability to get his mission done. And I think that allowed Batman to flourish a bit more and to have more elements and sides to the personality. But, you know, you go back to what was difficult about it. The difficult thing was just the amount of work. It was an incredible amount of work, because there was one point I remember doing Final Crisis, Return of Bruce Wayne, Batman and Robin, and 2 Batman issues, all at the same time for different artists. And that's all I remember of Batman, is this like white knuckle kind of every day I've got to do this amount of Batman pages, and there's no day where you can stop, and there's no day where even if you get up and you don't feel well, you can stop. So it was an onslaught. You know, I was really in the world of Batman in a very big way, like 24 hours a day, and that's what was unusual about it and quite difficult at the time for me. But I look back now and I'm glad that the work came out well. I think the work was served by that hothouse kind of atmosphere, and that sense of having to, you know, that's probably how Batman feels every day. You know, I've got to get up in the morning, I've got to get up and do the job.
One thing that, going back to Batman, is it was your first mainstream character, basically, because apart from the Vertigo stuff, the first thing that got you noticed was Arkham Asylum. And my idea is that, you know, like some people think that you kind of like to make things strange. But I think that with Batman Arkham Asylum, it's possibly the only instance where you were being a bit of a contrarian. You know, like you mentioned, being a punk in a world of a straight old man. And it seemed like, you know, like starting with that kind of Batman was a way to stand out. And after that, your stuff was not so punk, you know, in the sense it didn't need to stand out, but you were mainly telling your stories with your style. Did I give the right interpretation to?
Yeah, I mean, and with Arkham Asylum, obviously, once Dave McKean came on board, it changed everything. You know, as I've often said, I wrote the original script imagining Gary Leach or someone doing it. You know, I thought it would be quite a Brian Boland type thing. So in my head, it was very specific and very precise, and every little piece of dirt would be drawn in. Then Dave McKean came on, and he did a completely different, much more expressionistic approach. So that changed everything, and that pushed me towards, as you say, being a little bit more punk rock with it, because not only did it not read like any other Batman comic, it really didn't look like any other Batman comic. And if I'm being honest, the reason for it still being successful is the fact that it doesn't look like any other Batman comic. And it's really appeals to art students and production designers, because it's not like any other Batman comic. So I feel that gave it the edge. And then that edge, I just went with it, you know. But I remember I did think it was, for me, it was a very precise script. You know, it's very much beginning, middle, and end, and the imagery repeats throughout and concludes. And I thought it was really tight. But then people saw it and they just, you know, they thought it was like some kind of fever dream, which has dogged me through my entire career. You know, I put something out and everyone's got, I can't understand this. Then give it a year or two and put it in a collection, suddenly it's a classic, you know. But every time when things are coming out, people say, I don't understand, I can't understand a word of this, what is this? But it's just basic stories, and they're pretty well told, I think. But there does seem to be this thing that haunts me, that when I put something out, it seems to create this shock of the new or something that people don't. They say they can't deal with it, and then they go back and look at it and say, well, what was I thinking? You know, why did I ever find this difficult? I mean, you look at Final Crisis now, it's a pretty popular story, but back in the day, it was hated, it was pilloried. So I think My stuff, for some reason, it just has to wait a couple of years before people really feel comfortable with it, and I think they have to see it all together to make sense.
Is it because you've pretty much got very different references than most everyone else in comics, and maybe people are used to, you know, like thinking in terms of certain TV series or certain reference comics or certain books, and you know, you're bringing a wealth of influences that are not obvious in that respect.
Well, I wish I knew, because I think that people watch a lot of television, and there's a lot of weird television that they seem to have no trouble with.
Yeah.
But, you know, I'll do a television transition, for instance, where you turn the page and you're in a new scene and it's connected in some way, and people say, "Oh, the transitions don't make any sense. Why couldn't they have a little caption there?" Well, because you don't need one. All the color changes, all the characters are different. It's obviously a different scene, and if they saw that in television, they'd have no trouble, you know, figuring that out. Oh, we've changed a new scene because look, the lighting's different, the characters are different. In a comic, they can often struggle with things like that. If you don't write, "We are now in, you know, Times Square," or "We are now in the Vatican City," so that there are a lot of little things that I think people just miss out on at first. But my real belief is that it's just reputation kind of sticks to you, you know. And my reputation is I'm this weird guy. And people love to think that it just all goes, all flows out in an acid trip, and I don't have to think about it, you know. And the real truth is that my stuff is super meticulously plotted out. It's really tight, you know. There'll be a little detail here, but what I don't do is kind of point to all that. And I think that's why when people read it as a finished thing, they can make those connections themselves, and it suddenly starts to seem much more simple. But maybe in the monthly format where you can't remember what happened last issue, so you don't realise that panel 6 on page 5 was really relevant to panel 5 on page 3 of 2 issues down the line. And that, I think, only becomes apparent, that big picture only becomes apparent when people have an entire book in their hands. So it may be something like that, but I think it's just you get a reputation and that's it. You know, it's like everyone thinks Mark Waid is the Silver Age guy, even though he's not. Even though, you know, they think Mark Millar is this, you know, nasty kind of. He's not. He's a sort of seminary boy who wanted to be a priest when he grew up. So they pin labels on you, and the label will kind of follow you around through history, you know. And I think it's only in retrospect that people see that the label wasn't maybe, you know, it wasn't really useful.
Se questo video è piaciuto anche a voi, vi ricordo di iscrivervi al nostro canale YouTube e di cliccare soprattutto sulla campanella in modo tale da rimanere costantemente aggiornati sui nostri prossimi video e le nostre prossime interviste. Vi ricordo anche di continuare a seguire i canali social di Panini, quindi Facebook e Instagram. Trovate tutti i link in descrizione. Io vi ringrazio tanto, vi do appuntamento al prossimo video di Panini Comics Insider. Ciao!